Hey everybody, hope you're all well. We might as well jump in and get started because this could be a good half hour. It's actually going to be a very good half hour. So thank you everybody for joining. I'm Pete Townsend. I lead the Techstars Web3 Accelerator. Hugh McGurr is my partner in crime, but he has a terrible sickness today. He perhaps has COVID. He's not sure. Aches, pains, fevers, chills, you name it. So you just get me solo this evening or this morning or in the middle of the night, wherever you may be. So let's jump right in. As I mentioned, I am the MD of Techstars Web3. That's been since 2021. I've got a history in TradFi, but I'd always been on an entrepreneurial path. I thought I knew and had a tech undercurrent to everything that I did, and early in fintech, early in crypto. Started in crypto in 2016. You can get a hold of me there on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Telegram. I'm at Pete Townsend, very simple. So you can get me there as well. I also lead a podcast, Money Never Sleeps, where we look inside the minds of entrepreneurs and at the crossover, a whole bunch of different topics. And a lot of what we covered in the last year or two, maybe 3 years, has been in Web3, but try to keep some good founder stories going through that, as well as kind of the entertaining human interest stories so that it's not too terribly technical. Jumping right into fundraising. Fundraising is hard. It's really hard. It's going to be one of the most difficult things you do as a startup founder. Fundraising in Web3 is even harder. But if you learn the rules of the game, you might win. And it's even harder in Web3 because it's a lot more complicated. You've got a lot more to consider, a lot more to deal with. So what's the first thing you need to do? You've got to be ready. Get ready. These are hard-fought battles. They are campaigns. These are not year-long battles. If you are going into a year-long battle as opposed to a 6 to 9 month battle, there's something you're not doing right, okay? And that the CEO or project lead needs to view this as 2 full-time jobs. And you have to prioritize both. You have to prioritize everything you need to do to keep running the business. You've got to prioritize fundraising. That's why it helps to have really good co-founders. I'm talking about this from the perspective of your first fundraise. All right. That's where we're going to get a lot of the audience on with us today, is those that are going through or thinking about teeing up their first fundraise. One of the key messages is that only 10% of the investable ventures get funded, and that is investable ventures. Lots of ventures are uninvestable. They just either don't need venture capital or that they're just not ready for it yet. And that's something to keep in mind. If you are going to be truly ready to fundraise, you need to be in the top 10% of investable ventures in your category. Think about Web3. Would you put yourself in the top 10%? Of course, we're always optimistic and hopeful and feel proud of what we built, but you need to really ask yourself that question. Are you ready to do this? When you are pre-product, pre-revenue, when you're not even yet at testnet, you need to be able to communicate your story and how things are going to unfold. And it's critical to get your narrative into that position. This will be an extremely painful experience. You're going to question your own existence. You're going to question your own the existence of your startup, and that you're going to not believe some of the feedback that you get. It's going to be incredulous. You will laugh, you will cry, you will, pound the floor, pound the desk, pound the pavement. So it's going to be truly painful, emotional, but you got to go through hell to get out of it. So that's one way to look at it, okay? Second thing you need to think about is, how much do you need, right? When you're thinking about your first raise, there are some pros and cons. Do you go for a small first raise, like a pre-product, pre-revenue, pre-testnet, lining up perhaps a token round, thinking about 1 million or less, maybe a tiny bit more? And the benefits of that is that it seems like it's going to be easier to close, it's going to take less time, but you're going to appeal to a much smaller group of investors, because there are some investors that we talked to for our recent Techstars Web3 2024 class that were like, Pete, love the company, I love the idea, but it's too small of a raise for us. Love the project, but it's just their minimum check size is 2 million. So they're not going to write a 600K check into a 1 million round. And you need to find investors that are writing smaller checks. When investors are writing smaller checks, it'd be harder to do because you have less that are willing to lead the investment. We'll get onto that in a minute. Do you go with a larger raise and say, we're going to do 5 million first raise? And that may attract some bigger investors, obviously, but you need to have a really credible plan. You need to be able to say exactly how you're going to spend that 5 million, how long it's going to last you, and how you're going to be able to ramp up that quickly to be able to spend the 5 million. Generally, that should last you 12 to 18 months if you're getting onto the venture flywheel or merry-go-round, depending upon your perspective. That credible plan, critical part. You need to put together, what is this 12 to 18 month set of milestones going to look like? What are you going to achieve with that money? What is that investor buying with that 1, 2, 3, 5 million? All right. And those milestones need to be chunked into certain amounts of time across quarters for you to be able to communicate it as a credible plan. It needs to be credible, needs to be achievable, but it needs to be ambitious, because there's no point in getting venture money if you're just going to go slowly. You need to be able to move fast. You need to identify what kinds of investors that you want. How many types of investors do you want to package into this round? And when I put investors in quotes, that's for a reason, because some of them aren't really investors. Obviously, angels and VCs are investors. You need to think about Web 2 and Web 3. There are some Web 2 investors that have turned the corner into Web 3, but they're going to have different things that they care about versus pure Web 3 investors. You have to be able to consider both. We're only going to be able to really grow this space in Web 3 if we can actually truly pitch a Web 3 native proposition to a Web 2 investor and have them get it. Okay, and have them be able to get so excited about it that they want to fund it and get through their investment committee and so on and so forth. Launchpads, KOLs, ecosystems. KOLs aren't really investors, right? You give them a token allocation for speaking well about you and your token. That's another story altogether. Launchpads are basically a pass-through, and you have to be very careful with the fine print on what they do. Ecosystems, whether that be protocol, blockchain ecosystems, giving grants, making investments. And obviously, if you're going to get a grant from them, you're going to need to build on that specific protocol, or at least have that be part of your solution. Does that fit in with your value proposition and what you're offering? So it's a lot to think about there. So how much? It can't just be pick a number out of thin air. It needs to be, what is that number as part of your plan? And what is your plan? And who are the types of investors that are going to be interested in that? And even right down to what protocol are you building on? What blockchain are you building on? All right. Next, 3, lawyer up. And I can't say this enough. My mother's a lawyer. I have been influenced by legal mentality in my business career, but it's so critical and important, and especially in Web3 with the regulatory tenterhooks that we're all on right now. And you may say, well, if we could completely decentralize it, we're going to be away from all those legal considerations. Not really, because there's, you need to decide, not decide, but you need to at least think about, will your enterprise value, the value of what you're building, will that accrue to a token, to equity, or both? If you're going to build a truly decentralized network, there's no equity. There's no value in the equity. Okay, the token is what represents the value of the network, and you just become, as the founding team, dissolved basically, and you become perhaps leaders of governance on the network. And everything that you've built is packaged, and the value of that is packaged into a token. You may have both. You may have a token and equity, and say that you just have a labs entity, and that labs entity is a software development company, and there is truly revenue that is being delivered into that entity. You will have equity, and you will have a company to think about there. You might have just equity. You might just prefer to end up being a centralized entity. Just because you're building in Web3 doesn't mean you need a token. Building in Web3, you can be a SaaS product, okay? And that just shows the maturity of where Web3 is going, is that we do have SaaS providers that are providing solutions for those building in Web3. And they're not just developer tools. They're for all different elements of different Web3 ecosystems. You have to think about your legal docs, obviously, once you decide which way you're going to go here. And where we see most people going is a safe with token warrants. And that gives you some flexibility in your capital structure and lets you say, well, when a token is eventually launched, this investor will get the token. If during that point in time, you don't say this in the docs, but if during that point in time between funding a centralized operating company via a SAFE, a simple agreement for future equity, and then eventually your token generation event, however long away that may be, things may change. Things may shift. Had a founder from program last year who said initially did a SAFT, which was just a simple agreement for future tokens, and that was it. but his project didn't end up needing a token. But he only had a SAFT, and it's hard to repaper people afterwards. So it's a lot easier to do a SAFE with token warrants. Some investors may not care about the equity, and they may only want the token warrants. Some investors may see token warrants as a cherry on top and just want the equity. All depends upon their view. Obviously, your view on what you're doing and your vision is critically important, but it's still early. So it's really hard to put 100% faith into that. What you're saying is that the investor is saying, well, I want to protect myself if this is going to go in different directions. With lawyering up, you have a very specific and deliberate process, or tax bills and regulatory fines await. You need to situate things with your operating company, with the eventual issuance of tokens from that operating company to an offshore entity, that is your token entity, the eventual issuance from that offshore entity into the token holders and the investors. Okay, so there's a very deliberate process around this that needs to be done very carefully in order to demonstrate the decentralization of what you're building, if it is truly going to become decentralized. If you are building a centralized project and you want to put a token on top of it, that's called loyalty points. Just do loyalty points, people. Don't do a token. It creates so many problems if you don't really need it, okay? Finally, check references. Who have they helped? You always want to know who that lawyer is and who they might have helped successfully in the past, because without that, it can just be a lot of hot air. All right, next up, socialize your raise. Talk to as many founders as you can who've raised. The best source of an intro to an investor is not me. It is a founder who you know and who you're close with, who that VC that you want has already invested in, okay? Again, the best source of an intro to a VC is a founder who you know, who has already been invested in by that VC. All right. So you want to, when you've got your plan put together on what you're going to do, go tell people, go tell your friends, go tell your network, tell your parents, tell your dog, tell whoever. Tell as many founders as you can and get their feedback, because that's going to help shape what you're going to end up doing. You're going to get perspectives from successful founders who have done this before. All right. And that's one of the big things we do in Techstars, is that we make those types of resources and those contacts available. Build allies. You may be offered intro in the process, right? They may just say, really like what you're doing. So-and-so invested in my business, or I know this investor. I'd happily set up a call for you with them. Tell your investor contacts. Not everybody has investor contacts. We kind of assume, we cannot assume. That's where we get into to problems here. You can't assume that somebody has any investor contacts whatsoever. We have to prime the pump. That's one of the good things that Techstars does, is say, all right, listen, here are the investors you should be looking at. What are your intro paths to get in touch with them? Everybody in this planet, it isn't 6 degrees of separation. It's like something like 2.5. Okay, so there will be a path to find the investors that you really want. If it's completely cold, that's another conversation, but there's a solution to every problem. Okay. Build your materials. It is like a house of paper, because this is just paper. It is all just paper. Nothing has really, well, you've got a prototype built at this stage, right? And you could show people what you're doing, but your materials are like a big house of paper, okay? You've got your one pager and your light paper, your data room with FAQs. These are things that are expressive on, that you generally write first from a stream of consciousness and then condense down into presentable format. And these can just be documents. Your one pager should basically tell in a very short story your problem, your solution, your value proposition, who it's for, what your progress is, how you're raising. And we've got templates for that we can share with you during the program. Your deck takes things even further and condenses it down even further. You've got your send deck, which is a little bit longer and a little bit smaller font. And then your pitch version of that, which is something that you would only ever send. You would never send it to anybody, because it's only there as your background when you're pitching. All right. And it needs a voiceover in order to make sense of that. Your send deck is something that would have a little bit more of a story to it, but you would never pitch with that behind you, because you don't want people reading while you're speaking. All right. I eat my own dog food here. The font on these slides, 20-point font. Never use anything smaller than 20-point font when you're presenting. because people just have to read too much. They won't listen to you. Fast, update friendly. Everything needs to be able to be updated fast. It needs to be in a format, not with all these complicated images and visuals and animation. Because you're going to be making 60 to 70 different versions of your decks and of your materials. Tokenomics is going to be the most work and the hardest to change. So that is where the biggest chunk of your analysis needs to go and the biggest chunk of your preparation needs to go if you're going to be launching a token. Give everything a home. Notion works well or something similar. Notion is very user-friendly for data rooms. Townsend have data room type setups as well. Depending upon your payment plan, one may make more sense over the other. But the critical thing is that it's well organized, it's presentable, it's professional, and that people can access it easily and get all the information they need. Build your pipeline. That comes next. Okay. So you want to target at least 100 investors, whether that be angels, VCs, blockchain ecosystems, and target them carefully. Only those who should invest. You're not going to put people in there that won't likely invest in your stage or in your vertical. Obviously, I don't think anyone here would put in healthcare VCs into their Web3, unless you're some type of bioscience blockchain overlay. Okay. And I just made that up. But typically, your first round, you are targeting Web3 VCs. You may target some Web 2.5, like I said before, that have already turned the corner, but you want to make sure you're doing this right. I teach a whole class that's about an hour and a half long just on building your investor pipeline. Okay. You really want to identify intro paths. Like I said, the whole world is 2.5 degrees of separation. Tier your investors, A's, B's, and C's, and then pitch in reverse order. So your C's are the ones that should probably invest, but you don't really think they'd be that strategic for you. Start with them and perfect your pitch with them. Then you go to your B's, and then you go to your A's. A's are the ones you really want and who would be really strategic for you. Okay. Web 2.5 versus Web 3 investors. Again, that's something to think about. Some have turned the corner, and you just need to be mindful of them. The whole investor universe is on a bell curve, just like everything else. And there are those, the top 5% of those that in the Web 2 world that have turned the corner to Web 3. So they're hard to find, but they do exist out there. So look for those old school VCs like a Union Square Ventures, right? Now they invest a little bit later stage into Web 3, but they invest one of the earliest investors in Coinbase. Okay, so the Union Square Ventures are not a Web3 native VC, but they are investing into that space. Okay, so that's one thing to think about. Get warm intros. Founders are always shocked by the lack of the response they get, even with warm intros. So cold intros, just outreach. Hey, I think I know you. We're in the same city. No, that's not going to work. Getting a warm intro from somebody who knows that VC is a good route in, but you will still get no response sometimes. And I do that. Like I go to one of my MD colleagues in Techstars and I say, can you introduce me to this VC that you know? And that MD colleague of mine in Techstars may not get a response because it's the last time that you spoke with them. There's a big whole thing called social capital in VC collegial engagement and discussion. So just because you know somebody doesn't mean that they will, one, respond, two, respond favorably and say, yes, I will take that intro, or three, obviously write a check. Okay. So there's a lot to learn about how to get warm intros. Mind what you've socialized. When you socialize your raise in that earlier step that I talked about, you're going to build up some connections. You're going to build up some intro paths to VCs and other types of investors. And that should help you get warm intros. When you send them a nice email or on Telegram or whatever, say, hey, remember we were talking about this and you talked about that investor and my raise, and to let you know when we're going to go ahead and do it. Well, we're ready. Would you be able to connect me? I'll send you a forwardable blurb. And there's a whole template on how to do that as well. You want to get your tanks on the lawn. You want to be ready. With warm intros, what you're aiming to do is put yourself in a position to do 20 investor calls a week over 6 to 8 weeks. You may not always get to 20 each week, but averages out, you'll end up talking to 100 investors. And it may seem ridiculously unfathomable that you could ever do that, but when you prepare right, the numbers do add up. Meeting in person at events helps, but it can be a crapshoot. I'm going to DevCon in Bangkok next month, and that is going to be something where I'm expecting that I will probably meet founders there. I'll let people know that I'm going, and hopefully those that will be in the right stage for Techstars Web3 would be ones that I meet, but I may be meeting people from all different walks of life, all different stages. So having a meeting with an investor that you just meet cold randomly because you're going to an event, though that can be a total crapshoot. You have to, if you're going to go to an event for the purposes of meeting investors, you need to go with a plan. You need to find out who's going and make those contacts before you go. Side events, always get the side event list. That's where things are going to be a lot more intimate in terms of the number of attendees and where you'll be able to probably work your way into a conversation. 8, finally, execute and close. Crazy ideas versus helpful feedback. You're going to get some crazy ideas thrown at you. One of the founders from our last class who was raising via a safe with a token warrant. So they have a centralized operating company, plus they will be launching a token because they're going to decentralize that over the time. One of the VCs said to them, why the hell are you building a company? I don't want you building a company. I want you pumping that token, right? That's terrible to hear because, the VC, obviously, you have to distinguish between the VCs that just want to get in, write a check, get out, versus those that are going to be with you for the long haul, okay? You're going to get a lot of helpful feedback as you pitch. You just have to be careful how much you're going to build into your deck, how much are you going to use to kind of recycle things and revise and iterate things versus, hey, that's a nice piece of feedback. I'll consider that, but I may not change my whole deck framework for it. Having someone to talk about and bounce it off of when you're getting this type of feedback can be helpful after programs. I coach founders through the fundraising process or during the program if they are racing during the program, which is an excellent position to get yourself into. Do your tiered call plan. As I talked about, you got to move fast through that. You just have to go, pitch. Embrace the no because you're going to get 95 out of 100 no's. You have to learn to love the no. And there's a whole strategy to get to know and to get to getting more helpful feedback. Lead versus follow and legal due diligence. You got to find a lead investor. The lead investor is the one who writes the 10 to 50K check to their lawyer to do the legal due diligence. It needs to be a big enough investor where that check won't hurt and that they want to carry it, but not so big that they wouldn't invest in your round anyway. So it's tough to find. And there's a whole strategy of working your way through the process of your soft commits to be able to get to a lead. David Cohen's very good at that. Fine print with launch pads, market makers, and ecosystems. I've seen terrible things happen, and the worst nightmare you could ever imagine after raising $1 million, you got to give it all back, okay, because of fine print with launch pads. Launch pads can be incredibly helpful, but unless you're incredibly careful with how you do things with your token with them, it could just be a disaster. Market makers, the fine print there on providing liquidity and what they do, and then ecosystems on, hey, yes, we'll give you a grant, but we have the right to convert it into equity or into tokens in 2 years' time. So, you missed that in the document. That's why you got to lawyer up. Finally, every single detail matters. Heard a great saying this morning. If you sleep on a win, you will wake up with a loss. Okay. So you think you have a win, you go to sleep on it. Not everything's done. You will wake up with a loss. Okay. Recap, be ready. Be very ready. How much do you want to raise? Lawyer up, absolutely critical. Socialize your raise, build allies. Build your materials, but it's a house of paper. Okay. Remember that. It's not everything. Build your pipeline, and that is something that takes 10 to 12 hours even to get started. Get your warm intros, execute and close. Easier said than done. Okay. So that's my recap. All right. So my email address is there, pete.townsend@techstars.com. You can get in touch with me there. You can get in touch with me on Telegram. You can apply for the program at techstars.com/accelerator/web3. Podcast, as I mentioned, is Money Never Sleeps, spelled as all one word. And it's weekly. And we talk to Web3 founders. We talk to founders from all walks of life. We do deep dives on specific topics. So hopefully that's helpful to all of you as well. I think that's it. We got everything. Thank you, everybody. And would love to hear from you if you're interested in the program. Thank you.